lanechan.org. If you don't know what lanechan.org is, it's an anonymous image board similar to 8chan or 4chan. However, it's much more specialized, and the entire board is the entire website is themed around Cyberpunk, and specifically the anime Serial Experiments Lane, which if you know me, you know I'm a very big fan of. This website was once incredibly important to me, particularly the IRC. I used to go in the LaneChan IRC every night. I remember some crazy times that went there. I used to lurk a lot. I never quite fit in, but for a long time in my life, they were my friends. I want you to focus your attention on 3 words on this screen. Cyberpunk is buck. Cyberpunk is buck. And then there's a picture of a cyber buck underneath it. What could these words possibly mean? Well, I'll have you know it's not always been like this, because previously it said Cyberpunk is duck and had a picture of a duck. But before that, it said Cyberpunk is dead. The biggest, arguably, cyberpunk forum discussion space on the internet. One of the biggest, if not the biggest. And on the front page, in big letters, it says, Cyberpunk is dead. Is this just irony, posting, typical Chan humor, self-deprecation, in the same way that the biggest metal website is called Metal Sucks? A similar thing. Is it that? Probably. But am I gonna read too much into this? You fucking bet I am. But cyberpunk is just a genre of fiction. What makes something real or fiction? What really is the difference between the two? I mean, this should be a really obvious question. Real things are tangible, real things exist, and fake things don't exist. But there is actually some sort of gradient between the two. At this point, it's sort of an accepted thing that we are travelling towards the cyberpunk future, that the world of cyberpunk dystopia and real life are colliding, except that the version that we live in is much less cool because it's not fictionalized. People who can't really tell the difference between reality and fantasy fit into 2 categories. You've got the chronically mentally ill, and you've got the LARPers. I'm talking about delusional people who just have mental illnesses. That's something completely different. Not talking about that here. LARPers, what would be known in Japan as chunibyo kind of thing. This is another person who, in a sense, has delusions, but it's not really in the same way as like a sort of schizophrenic would have delusions, or a paranoid would have delusions. It's more of like a wish to live in some other fantasy reality. So speaking of LARPers, I have referred to myself as a cyberpunk LARPer before. Now, I don't really know where role-playing stops and real life begins, though. This is what I'm trying to say. I didn't start making cyberpunk music because I thought it would be cool and make me feel like someone out of a William Gibson novel. I did it because that's what came out when I made music. It was just that. That's the amalgamation of my inspirations. It sounds cyberpunky, it sounds punky, and it's electronic. You know? But then, I may as well embrace it while I'm here. There's no reason to ignore that fact. Cyberpunk is a thing, and what I'm doing is cyberpunk adjacent. I'm going to be saying cyberpunk a lot in this video. It's going to stop sounding like a word very quick. It's going to sound like just the noises. It's not going to make any sense. So why say cyberpunk is dead? Well, it is dead. It's a genre from the 80s. It's been played out. There's not really that much you can do new in the genre. Pretty much every story that could have been told within that genre, or every idea that could have been explored, has been explored much better than any of us could do, at least in terms of literature and fiction and film and animation. there's still probably some space to be explored within music and within visual art, I think, but that's something else. That's something let's put that over there. We'll just know what I'm talking about. Let's take a look at the Ghost in the Shell remake. When I wrote the draft for this video, when I wrote the bullet points of what I was going to talk about, that remake was still like relatively fresh in people's memories, but you may not remember it. They remade Ghost in the Shell, the original film, with Scarlett Johansson. This is peak cyberpunk spectacle, what I was talking about in the last episode of this series. Something which started off as anti the system ends up being co-opted into said system. You take something that was once rebellious, you wait a bit, you tone it down, you put Scarlett Johansson in the lead role, and you sell it back to someone. That's it. There's nothing more to say on that subject. If you've seen the first video, which I hope you have, it's on this channel, if you've seen the first video, you will understand that concept. So now that Cyberpunk has been co-opted by the mainstream, co-opted by the big companies that are using it to sell it back to us, what can we do to keep pushing the same thought process forwards? We need to post-Cyberpunk. And post-Cyberpunk is already a genre, but it's shit. You see, oftentimes an example of post-Cyberpunk that's given is Psychopass, because it is a future urban environment where there is some grittiness and detective story, like a noir-esque, like Blade Runner-esque story, but in the end it's not a dystopia, it's a utopia, and the problem is systematic, and it doesn't come down hard on whether the civil system is good or bad, etc, etc. That's given as an example of post-Cyberpunk, and while I think it's kind of halfway between, it's sort of like halfway between cyberpunk and post-cyberpunk. That is essentially what post-cyberpunk means. It's instead of a cyberpunk dystopia, you take similar ideas and see what would happen if it turned out well. And I think that's shit, because that is just a boring topic to explore. Psychopass does it well by mixing the two elements, by expanding upon cyberpunk and also pushing it forwards. This is good. However, there's many post-cyberpunk texts out there that are not so good. Generally the idea is shit and ruins everything that cyberpunk is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about a sort of generally anti-authoritarian rebellion. It's supposed to be about real people, high-tech, low life, right? When you push through that and you get rid of the low life, you've just gotten rid of half of the appeal rather than adding something new. So you have to add something new. Well, Psychopass does still have the high-tech, low-life thing, which is why at the heart I don't necessarily classify it as strictly post-cyberpunk. It still fits within cyberpunk because there is high-tech and there's low-life. But so if post-cyberpunk is shit, what do us aging cyberpunks need to do? Where do we need to go from here? What is the real post-cyberpunk? What comes next? Because cyberpunk has been co-opted and post-cyberpunk never really successfully was birthed in really a satisfying way. There was never a post-cyberpunk movement that should have happened. It never really did, unless, I mean, there's some elements of cyberpunk that then got transcended into things like the hard sci-fi, more modern hard sci-fi, and all that bullshit, right? And it's all got mangled in there. So in a sense that's post-cyberpunk, but it's not like, it's more like taking elements of cyberpunk and working it into its own thing. So what comes next for us who are passionate about cyberpunk but think that it's a bit played out at this point? Well, this is where I recommend we take a listen to Death Grips. Yes, as always, Death Grips are the people who know what they're talking about when it comes to cyberpunk, because Death Grips has been described as cyberpunk before, but I wouldn't necessarily classify them there. But they're somewhere, they're kind of taken ideas of cyberpunk but pushed it forwards, almost like exactly what I'm talking about. So let's ask them how they would describe themselves.
We describe our music as accelerated.
Oh, you would describe yourself as accelerated, would you? Very interesting. Very interesting. Maybe we should start thinking about what acceleration means. Should we be accelerating something? What should we be accelerating? Where does this acceleration come from? You can't move something without a force pushing it. So who's pushing it? Where? Where are we going? Where are we accelerating towards? And why? All these are interesting questions. And bam! We've raised way more interesting questions than what if Cyberpunk was good, actually. Like the traditional post-Cyberpunk thing. I've just named a bunch of them off.
Naming them off.
But what is acceleration? Well, this instantly makes me think about accelerationist politics. You got the CCRU is probably the most well-known example of this political, this philosophical and political, what's it called? Pastiche milieu. The CCRU including Nick Land and Mark Fisher and Salvi. I forgot what the other person's name is, but those guys, and then Code 9, who just made drum and bass, which is fucking sick. Imagine you have a philosophy department, and one of the three of you just write books, and one of them just writes fucking electronic music. Fucking sick. So accelerationism is something that's very interesting, and I think it has a lot of potential to birth interesting artistic movements. And there's been some, but it's lacking as sort of a defined thing. I mean, death grips describe themselves as accelerated, but I haven't seen anything that really explicitly refers to accelerationist politics. So how do we push through? Where, how, who, and why do we create our accelerated art? Where do we put it? Who's doing it? What will it look or sound or feel like? Well, all of this will be answered at a later date, but starting off with the next episode of World is a Fuck. Yes, this series is back. Subscribe, Patreon, I need money, music, Bandcamp, down below, new album, it's there. Accelerate the collapse, boys, accelerate the collapse.